Once upon a time there was a cottage, and the cottage was on the edge of a wood. It was July. The weather was hot, but out of the wood came a very cool breeze that came into the top window of the cottage and tickled the nose of the little girl who was lying in her bed. She woke up and she stretched and she yawned. And then she heard her mother's voice, and her mother said, "Come down, it's your birthday." She was so excited. She leapt out of bed and ran down the stairs. And of course, you know who I'm talking about. This is the story of Little Red Riding Hood, but before she was called Little Red Riding Hood. And this is the story of how she got her red hood. She came down the stairs and her mother said, "Happy birthday, my darling. We've got a present for you." The girl ran over to the table and opened the present and pulled out a beautiful riding cape with a hood, and it was white, shimmering white and as light as a feather. What beautiful smooth silk! Oh, thanks, Mother. It's so beautiful. She put it on, and her mother opened her arms and said, "Come here." And when she held her little girl, she said, "My dear daughter, happy birthday." And her eyes glinted, and her mouth crumpled into a sneer. She held her daughter by the shoulders and said, "Well, I want you to go to your granny, because your granny, you know, the one that lives in the woods, she's very sick. Will you please bring her some food in my basket?" "Of course I will, Mother. May I wear my white hood?" "Of course you will, darling. Of course you will." So, armed with the basket, the little girl made her way to the door, opened the door, waved goodbye to her mother, and ran towards the wood. The mother went to the door, watched her daughter go, waved, and said, "Soon you will die." She cackled like a goose, slammed the door and went back inside. Well, the little girl walked whistling through the wood, listening to the birds, listening to the animals creep around in the undergrowth. But then she noticed that the sound stopped, all of a sudden, all at once. No birds, no animals, nothing. The wood itself seemed to get darker, seemed to encroach on the path. She looked ahead. She saw a woman, a black shadow, wearing a shawl. She was an old woman, and the girl approached the old woman. Then the old woman span round and looked at the girl. Her red, slanted eyes peered into the girl's very soul. Her lips cracked, her mouth opened, and blood streamed out. She smiled. "Oh, no," said the girl. The old woman reached down and pulled out a razor-sharp sword. She beckoned the girl with a finger. "No, no!" The girl didn't exclaim just in fear. She exclaimed in recognition, for that monster, that excuse for a human being, was in fact her grandmother. How was she going to get away? She turned, she began to run, she tripped, she fell. She heard the grandmother approaching behind her, but something in her white hood glowed. Something strange, and a prickle went through her body. She became completely invisible, and she kept still as the grandmother, panting, looked around, standing almost over her, brandishing the razor-sharp sword. "Where is she? Where is she? Where is she?" Quickly, Red Riding Hood, now invisible, scrambled to her feet and ran. The grandmother saw the bushes parting, the footprints in the leaves, and followed them. She ran and ran and ran, and then said, "I can't run any more." She stopped, and as she did so, the grandmother gained on her. But Red Riding Hood She stepped back and grabbed the sword from her grandmother and plunged the sword into her grandmother's shrunken, shriveled heart, withdrew it, and the creature lay slumped on the ground. Poor Red Riding Hood. She looked around at the trees, which were now dripping with blood spatter, and she looked at her hood, which was now dyed red, the colour of grandmother's blood. Not knowing what to do, she ran and ran until she found the path, and ran until she found the cottage, her grandmother's cottage. She opened the door, she walked in, she looked around. This couldn't be true. Maybe that creature in the woods wasn't her grandmother. And somebody spoke. She looked, and standing in the shadow of the cupboard was a huge, huge creature. It was a wolf. The wolf stepped out of the shadows and said, "Red Riding Hood, your mother and grandmother have betrayed you. They wanted to kill you. Well, they didn't manage to do it. So I will." He stepped forward. Red Riding Hood grabbed the hilt of her sword, and by the end of it, the whole cottage was dripping with blood. And that's the end of the story.